This is lesson 38 on USP Chapter 800 and the Florida rules on compounding, and it covers book pages 241 through 259. So as I mentioned earlier, USP Chapter 800 on hazardous drugs has not been adopted by the Florida Board of Pharmacy, but I did choose to include it in the book and as well as in this course because there were specific references to hazardous drugs in the MPJE competencies, and previous versions of it referred specifically to USP 800. Now, in my way of thinking, since Florida has not adopted USP 800, they should not ask a question on this, but I just can't guarantee it because of those specific references that used to be in the MPJE competency statements. So we'll just give you a brief overview of USP 800 just in case something on this shows up on the MPJE. So USP 800 sets standards for handling hazardous drugs, either in the compounding process or just in the receiving of these particular products. It's important to note that USP 800 is really purpose is to protect the workers, protect the pharmacists and the pharmacy technicians, or whoever the workers are that deal with hazardous drugs in the workplace environment. This is different than USP 797, which is trying to protect the sterility of compounded sterile products, which will eventually go to patients. It's really a patient protective goal for USP 797. USP is important for us workers who are working in the pharmacy. Now, it says on the bottom of 241 that USP Chapter 800 became official on December 1st, 2019. However, it's official, but it's not enforceable yet because it's not enforceable until the new versions of USP 795 and 797 become enforceable, which won't happen until later in 2023. However, despite that, it has been in the MPJE competencies since 2019, so that, again, that's why it's included in the book. So on page 242, letter B, there's a list of hazardous drugs that's put out by the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, also known as NIOSH. I did not include the NIOSH list in the book just to save some room. The list is updated approximately every 2 years. You should know that the list is split up into two different tables, and I know that table 1 includes all the anti-neoplastic drugs, which are probably the most common hazardous drugs that pharmacies deal with. But you should know that there are some drugs that are not anti-neoplastic drugs that also fit into the hazardous drug category. There's a good study tip for you on page 243 to let you know that not all hazardous drugs have to be handled the same way. Hazardous drugs that are simply going to be counted or packaged may not require all of the containment procedures that we're going to talk about that anti-neoplastic drugs might require. So there is some flexibility, and facilities that use hazardous drugs actually have to perform a risk assessment, I believe annually, about how they're going to mitigate the risk of exposure to the hazardous drugs in the work environment. So I'm just going to highlight some of the USP 800 requirements starting on the bottom of page 243. The first one is each facility that handles hazardous drugs must have a designated person. This is the person responsible for developing and implementing all the hazardous drug handling procedures. Obviously, this person's got to be trained and qualified and have a good understanding of the processes in the facility as well as the hazardous drugs themselves. A summary of the facilities and engineering controls can be found on page 244. This requires things in the facility like having signs in appropriate places and entrances so people know that hazardous drugs may be stored in this area, restricted access to certain areas. There may be requirements to have negative pressure gradients in certain areas. There's a lot of things have to go into the design of the facility and controls in the facility to reduce the exposure of hazardous drugs to the workers. There's a section in letter E about when you receive hazardous drugs into your facility. I remember this was big concern because a lot of people thought that USP 800 required a negative pressure area where hazardous drugs are received. And it doesn't really say that. It says that the area has to be either negative pressure or neutral pressure relative to the surrounding area. So a general receiving area is acceptable. The only issue is it can't be a positive pressure area that's pushing air into the workers. So read that carefully. It's not a negative pressure area. It could be negative, or it could be a neutral one as well. So generally, you don't have to create a new area where hazardous drugs are received, as long as it's not a positive pressure area. Storage of hazardous drugs, on the other hand, is a little bit different. So storage has to be, these products have to be in a place that can prevent spillage or breakage. The other important thing to remember is the hazardous drugs have to be stored separately from the non-hazardous drugs. One of the big issues with USP 800, you'll see is on number 3 on page 245, is the room that stores any NIOSH Table 1 drugs, including those anti-neoplastic hazardous drugs, has to be vented to the exterior of the building. That could be a big deal. It may require some remodeling of facilities, so that there are a lot of cost implications when USP 800 is finally becomes enforceable. Not only does it have to be vented to the outside of the building, it must have at least 12 air changes per hour. ACPH is an abbreviation for air changes per hour. That's kind of a big one. The receipt of the products is not as big a deal as people thought, but from what I understand, the storage of these hazardous drugs having to be vented to the outside of the facility can be problematic for many institutions. Okay, turn over to page 245 and let's talk about compounding with hazardous drugs. Obviously, if you're compounding with hazardous drugs, you're going to have to develop standard operating procedures that explain your process, that also talk about personal protective equipment, and we'll go over the requirements for that a little bit later. But the primary thing you're going to have with compounding hazardous drugs are your engineering controls, how you're going to protect the workers. And this starts with containment engineering controls. And there's 3 types of containment engineering controls. There's a containment primary engineering control. This is the biological safety cabinet, is what we used to use when we were making chemotherapy. A biological safety cabinet, or a compounding aseptic containment isolator, or CACI, that are used to prepare sterile products of hazardous drugs. These primary engineering containment primary engineering control devices have to maintain ISO class 5 conditions for sterile compounding. Turning over to page 246, we then have the containment secondary engineering control, which, just like in 797, this is actually the room where the primary containment, the containment primary engineering control, where the biological safety cabinet is actually contained. And you'll see on number 6 on page 246, the room where the CPEC is located in, which is called the CSEC, has to have a negative pressure gradient of 0.01 to 0.03 inches of water column, and has to be vented to the exterior of the facility. Again, that becomes a big deal as far as when you facility design and construction, when hospitals and other entities are trying to comply with these USP 800 requirements. The third and final type of containment engineering control are the containment supplemental engineering controls, and these are things that are used in the compounding process, such as closed system drug transfer devices that offer additional protection from the person who's doing the compounding, and you can read that in number 7 on page 246. And then there are additional things you want to do. You have to have, if you're dealing with hazardous drugs, like having an eye wash station, safety showers, fire blankets, and things like that. And you'll see in number 9, generally, if you're doing both sterile and non-sterile compounding with hazardous drugs, They generally have to be located in separate rooms. The primary, the containment primary device, the biological safety cabinet, generally have to be in separate rooms. However, they can be in the same room at least 1 meter apart if certain conditions are met. You can read that in number 9 on page 246. And just like the IV hoods under Chapter 797, number 10 tells you that your containment primary engineering controls and your secondary, your rooms, have to be certified every 6 months. So let's go over the non-sterile compounding with hazardous drugs found on page 247. I'm not going to go through the details, you can read those, but the chart kind of summarizes what the engineering controls are for non-sterile hazardous compounding. And they are slightly different than for non-sterile than they are for sterile. You'll see with the non-sterile compounding, whereas the room itself, the containment SEC, does have to be externally vented and have negative pressure that we talked about already. The device itself, the primary containment device, it's preferred that it is also externally vented, but there is an option if you can use where you have redundant HEPA filters in the series. That is an option if you're doing non-sterile hazardous drug compounding. You'll see that's not an option when we get to the sterile compounding in the next slide. So let's look at the engineering controls for sterile hazardous drug compounding. And as you can see from the chart on the slide, also in your book on page 248, here we have both the biological safety cabinet or your primary engineering control device has to be vented externally, as well as the room itself, the secondary engineering control. So you don't have that option that you had with the non-sterile compounding. In addition, there's some slight variation here depending on your configuration of your setup to compound these products. If you're working in an ISO Class 7 buffer room with ISO Class 7 anti-room, then you can get by with 70 air changes per minute with a positive pressure anti-room. If you don't have that setup and you just have a room, then you're required to have 12 air changes per minute. You can see that in the chart on page 248. In both instances, however, remember you still have to meet the negative pressure requirements as previously described. So there are additional requirements under USP Chapter 800 that are on page 248, starting with documentation and standard operating procedures. I think Patty does a really good job of summarizing these for you, so I'm not going to sit here and read them to you. But these include documentation and standard operating procedures on page 248, requirements for receiving, labeling, packaging, and transport and disposal of hazardous drugs on the bottom of page 248. And then the details that I mentioned earlier about personal protective equipment can be found on page 249. You should note in the personal protective equipment section, there are certain situations where you have to actually wear 2 pairs of gloves and possibly 2 shoe coverings and so forth. So a lot of extra precautions have to be taken, obviously, with these hazardous substances. Additional requirements on cleaning, spill control, and medical surveillance and environmental quality control procedures can be found on pages 250 and 251. Okay, I want to cover the Florida rules on compounding starting on page 251. This is the definition of compounding you see in the rules on page 251. It's a fairly broad definition of compounding. If you turn over on page 252, you'll notice at number 2 at the top, though, however, it says that the preparation of drugs for sale or transfer to pharmacies or practitioners for purposes of for them dispensing it or further distributing the product is not compounding. So what the study tip there tells you is that if you compound it for practitioners for them to resell or distribute it, that is not considered compounding. However, you might be able to do office use compounding if they can actually use the product in their office and not sell it or further distribute the product. However, that's even fairly limited now because of the Compounding Quality Act under federal law that we talked about having to do with 503A and 503B facilities, and you really have to read this section carefully, because it sounds like you can do office use compounding in Florida, but in the end you cannot do it for human use unless you are also licensed as a outsourcing facility. So it's unfortunate, because when you read this section, it sounds like you can do it on page 252, and you get to the very end of this rule on page 253 on letter 6 VII in the middle of the page there, and it says, when compounding products for office use intended for human use, the pharmacy must also be registered as an outsourcing facility in compliance with all requirements for outsourcing facilities that we talked about in Chapter 1. The interesting thing about this is for both sterile and non-sterile products. Even though outsourcing facilities are really only for sterile products, this has been interpreted to say that a pharmacy, which is a 503A facility, not a 503B facility, cannot do office use compounding for sterile products and also for non-sterile products unless they are registered as an outsourcing facility. So the only time a pharmacy, a 503A pharmacy in Florida, can compound a product to be sent to an office to be used if it's for veterinary use. And you see that in the study tip on page 253. If you're not an outsourcing facility, you're just a regular pharmacy, compounding pharmacy, you cannot do office use compounding unless it's for a veterinarian. And I emphasize that a little bit because I don't think it's very well known by pharmacists in Florida, and I keep seeing pharmacists in Florida get disciplined for this at the Florida Board of Pharmacy meetings. And to be honest with you, it wasn't clear to me until I read the rule very carefully about that part, about having to be registered as an outsourcing facility. Florida also has a specific rule about batch record keeping when you're doing compounding. It requires things like the date the batch was compounded, a control number or batch number, the actual formula that you use, and the source of your raw materials. So make sure you read through that rule on pages 253 and 254. Okay, so Florida has a specific rule on sterile compounding, and conveniently enough, they numbered it 797, but it's chapter 27.797. And what happened here was Florida adopted USP 797, the 2008 version that we talked about. But when they did so, they also adopted some other chapters which come into play, such as Chapter 71 for sterility tests when you're doing high-risk compounding, and also for another practice that we'll talk about in just a moment, and also Chapter 85 and 731. So I don't think you need to know the details of Chapters 71, 85, and 731, unless you're actually doing these types of processes. But for purposes of MPJ, you should know that these are the chapters that Florida has adopted. Chapter 797 for sterile compounding, Chapter 71 for sterility tests, Chapter 85 for bacterial endotoxin tests, and Chapter 731 for loss on drying. So what you see in the Florida 797 rule is the clarifications that Florida wanted to make, some variances where they're going to allow something that's different from 797, and some exceptions as well. So they adopted 797 with these particular changes. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but if you read through these variances and exceptions, this is where Florida said we're going to differ slightly from the USP 797 standards. And they're listed for you word for word from the rule on pages 255 and 256. And then on the bottom of page 256 is a new rule, relatively new rule, for sterile compounded products that include a process of lyophilization. This is kind of a complex process, and when you're doing lyophilization, it really looks more like manufacturing to me. But Florida is saying that you can do this under the sterile compounding rule, but there are a bunch of additional precautions that you have to take. And this is very technical. I don't really understand all of it, but just know that it has to be done in the ISO 5 environment. Laminar airflow hood. You can read through that. It requires sterilization, and that's where a lot of these other chapters come in, such as Chapter 71. These are referenced in the what I call the lyophilization rule as well. So I recommend you read through that on pages 256, 257, over to 259. It's pretty detailed stuff, but like I said, this lyophilization stuff, it's still sterile compounding under Florida law because of this rule, but it sure, looks like with all these protections that it's very similar to manufacturing, and I sometimes wonder if FDA would take issue with this type of process, whether it is actually manufacturing. Okay, with that, we've finished lesson 38, and we've finished this particular chapter. The last lesson will be chapter 39, covering chapter 6, and we'll just briefly mention chapter 7 as well.